What would you do if the only thing standing between you and the man who terrified you was a complete stranger and a lie? Rosalind Thorne is a woman who has built her entire life on precision, on facts, on evidence. She does not make impulsive decisions. She does not ask strangers for favors, and she absolutely does not ask a man she has never met to kiss her in the middle of a glittering ballroom full of London's most powerful people. But tonight, Sebastian Crane is watching her from across the room, and Rosalind knows, with every nerve in her body, that if she doesn't do something in the next 30 seconds, her carefully constructed life is about to come apart. So she turns to the quiet Korean man standing beside her at the bar, the one with the steady eyes and the untouched glass of champagne, the one who looks like he belongs here and nowhere near here at the same time. And she says the most reckless thing she has ever said in her 31 years of life.
Kiss me. He's watching.
What she doesn't know is that Hyunjun Im has been waiting for this night for a very long time. Not for her. He didn't know she existed until 4 minutes ago. But for Sebastian Crane. And the moment he sees the fear in her eyes, everything changes. What follows is a single night that will unravel secrets neither of them was prepared to face, and a connection neither of them was prepared to survive. If you love stories where two strangers collide under the worst possible circumstances and somehow find the best thing that ever happened to them, you are in exactly the right place. Subscribe so you never miss a story. And tell me in the comments, have you ever done something completely impulsive to protect yourself? And had it change your life? I want to know. The Harwick Foundation Gala was the kind of event where the chandeliers cost more than most people's annual salary, and everyone in the room knew it, and pretended not to. It was held every March at Harwick House, a Georgian mansion in Mayfair that smelled of old money and fresh flowers, and the particular kind of ambition that only reveals itself after the third glass of wine. Rosalind Thorne had been invited because of her work. That was the only reason she was ever invited anywhere that required a floor-length gown. She was 31 years old, a biomedical researcher at King's College London, and her team had spent the last 4 years developing a predictive diagnostic model for early-stage neurodegenerative disease, the kind of work that made foundations want to put their names on things. She had not wanted to come tonight. She had said this clearly to her department head, Dr. Adiz Okonkwo, who had looked at her over the rim of her reading glasses with the particular expression she reserved for statements too obvious to deserve a response. The Whitmore Group is considering a £2 million partnership. Rosalind, you will go. You will smile. You will drink exactly enough champagne to seem personable. So she had come. She had worn the navy dress she bought 2 years ago for a conference in Edinburgh, and never worn since, because she had left that conference early, before the dinner, and she had not let herself think too carefully about why. She had done her hair. She had arrived at 7:45, shaken approximately 14 hands, smiled at approximately 47 people, and spent the last 20 minutes standing at the bar trying to make a single glass of champagne last long enough to justify her continued presence. She was very good at appearing comfortable in rooms where she wasn't. She had been practicing that particular skill for most of her professional life. The precise calibration of warmth and distance that allowed people to feel welcomed without actually being let in. Tonight, it cost more than usual. There was a tightness across her shoulders that no amount of deliberate breathing quite reached. And then she felt it. That particular sensation she had learned to recognize over the past 8 months. The slow drag of a gaze she hadn't invited. The awareness of being watched not with admiration, but with ownership. The way a person looks at something they've already decided belongs to them. She turned her head slowly, carefully, the way you approach something dangerous, and found him across the room. Sebastian Crane, 44 years old, former investment partner at Crane Whitmore Capital, which his grandfather had built and his father had doubled, and which he had nearly destroyed twice through decisions that somehow always managed to stay just on the legal side of catastrophic. He was standing beside the foundation's chairman, a glass of something amber in his hand, and he was smiling at the chairman while his eyes were entirely on her. He had a quality, Sebastian Crane, of always watching the room from multiple directions simultaneously. It was the kind of skill that you developed when you had spent your entire life in spaces where other people wanted things from you, and you needed to stay precisely one step ahead of all of them at once. She recognized it because she had spent the past 8 months studying everything about him she could find, the way you study a weather system, not because you could stop it, but because knowing what it was going to do gave you a few seconds more to move. Her grip tightened on the champagne flute. It had started 8 months ago, at a research funding symposium in Edinburgh, the same conference for which she'd bought this dress, and never worn it, because she'd left early. She had given a presentation on the second morning. The preliminary results of the diagnostic model had drawn more attention than she'd anticipated. They were good, genuinely good. Not the kind of good you qualify when you're presenting to a room full of scientists who will interrogate every word, but the kind of good that changes the shape of a problem that has been resistant to solution for a long time. Sebastian Crane had approached her afterward, with what she'd initially read as professional interest. He was well briefed, his questions specific and technically informed, and she'd answered them honestly because she was always honest about her work. By the time she understood what his interest actually was, he had already learned where she worked, where she lived, and, most critically, that her research contained data. Specifically, 4 years of proprietary diagnostic benchmarks built on a dataset that his firm had partially funded in 2019 before withdrawing when early results looked unpromising. He wanted that data. He believed it belonged to him, and when she'd engaged the university's legal team and made clear, through 3 separate and increasingly specific letters, that it did not, his manner had shifted from professionally persistent to something she didn't have a clean word for. Not threatening enough to meet a legal threshold, too deliberate to be coincidence. Phone calls from blocked numbers that disconnected when she answered. A car she'd started recognizing outside her flat in Bermondsey. A dark blue Audi, parked for hours, gone when she came back. A message, typed and formal, delivered to her university email from an address that routed back to a shell company. We should discuss terms before this becomes complicated. She had reported all of it. She had documentation. She had a case building slowly through proper channels, and her solicitors told her she was doing everything right, and none of that helped her tonight, in this ballroom, with Sebastian Crane's eyes tracking her across 40 feet of candlelit Georgian splendor. She turned back to the bar, set her champagne down, pressed her fingertips against the cool marble edge, and breathed slowly through her nose. The cold of the marble helped. She had read somewhere that grounding yourself in physical sensation was supposed to interrupt the body's threat response, and she had been testing this theory for 8 months with mixed results. There was a man standing 2 feet to her left. She wasn't sure when he'd arrived. He had the quality of someone who moved through spaces without announcing himself, which was the kind of thing you noticed only after the fact. Korean. She registered instinctively. Dressed in a dark suit that was expensive in the way that very good things are, not announced, just evident. He was looking at something across the room with an expression of perfectly calibrated neutrality that she recognized, with the particular clarity that comes from having worn it yourself for 8 months, as very careful attention disguised as none. His champagne glass was full, untouched. She did not make impulsive decisions. She was a scientist. She gathered data, she formed hypotheses, she tested them through deliberate, methodical process, and she did not deviate from that process based on the pressure of a single moment, no matter what the moment felt like. And then she looked back at Sebastian Crane, who had taken 3 steps in her direction while the chairman's back was turned, and something primal and exhausted and furious rose up through 8 months of careful, measured, appropriate response, and she turned to the man beside her. "Kiss me," she said. Low. Controlled. Not a whisper. Whispers carry. He's watching. The man turned his head. His eyes met hers. And in the space of approximately 2 seconds, he seemed to read the entire situation. Her rigid posture, her white-knuckled grip on the bar, the direction she'd been looking, the distance between her and the man she wasn't looking at, with a precision that should have been unsettling and instead felt, absurdly, like being understood. "Then let's make it look real," he said. His hand came up to the side of her face, careful, asking. And she nodded once, and then his mouth was on hers. It was not a tentative kiss. It was not the performance she'd expected. A brief press of lips designed to satisfy a single glance from across the room. It was something that felt, with disorienting clarity, like a decision. Like he had determined in those 2 seconds that if he was going to do this, he was going to do it with the full conviction that made it believable. His other hand came to rest lightly at her waist, and he angled his body toward her the way people do when they're genuinely absorbed in each other, blocking her from the room's line of sight, in a way that was either pure instinct or very precise strategy, and she found she couldn't tell which. What she found, when she had a coherent thought again, was that she had stopped thinking about Sebastian Crane entirely. When he pulled back, she became aware that her free hand had found the lapel of his jacket at some point she couldn't identify. She released it, smoothed it, reflexively, as though she hadn't just been holding onto a stranger in the middle of a crowded ballroom. "Is he still looking?" she asked. He didn't look away from her face. "He's moved toward the far corridor. The chairman followed him." She exhaled, one long, controlled breath. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said. And then, almost to himself, with the air of someone revising a calculation mid-step, this just became considerably more complicated. His name was Hyunjun Im. He told her this after he'd guided her, with a hand barely touching her elbow, through a side door and down a corridor, and out through a set of French doors onto a stone terrace overlooking a garden lit by low amber lights. The garden was empty. The cold was immediate and real, and she welcomed it. He was 35. He ran a private investment firm, Im Capital Partners, with offices in Seoul and London. He had been in London for 3 weeks, staying at a service apartment in Clerkenwell. He had been invited to the gala through a mutual contact at the Harwick Foundation, who'd suggested it might be a productive opportunity to explore philanthropic investment in medical research. He delivered all of this information with the composure of someone reading from a carefully prepared document, and Rosalind listened carefully and understood that none of it was a lie, and none of it was the whole truth. She had spent 8 months learning the difference. "You knew who he was," she said. Not a question. A pause. Not long, but real. The kind of pause that means the answer has been anticipated, and the person is deciding how to give it rather than what to say. "Yes." "Before I said anything to you." "Yes." She studied him in the amber light. His face was unhurried. He met her gaze with the same steadiness he'd shown at the bar. The kind of steadiness that doesn't come from indifference but from the long practice of remaining present in difficult situations without letting the difficulty take over. "Then you need to tell me why," she said. "Because I've just kissed a stranger at a gala, and I'd like to understand what I've walked into." He turned to face the garden. The amber lights made small pools in the carefully maintained darkness between the hedges. Sebastian Crane's firm partially funded a research initiative in 2019, a small neurological dataset project, early stage, limited scope. They pulled funding when initial outcome markers looked weak. I know this. That data belongs to my team. The withdrawal of funding was documented, the agreement clearly structured. They have no legal claim. Legally, no. He turned back to her. But Crane has been making a different kind of claim. Not legal. Social. He's been telling certain people, quietly, in rooms like this one, that the withdrawal was a mistake, that the dataset represents an oversight in the original funding terms, that he has grounds to revisit the arrangement. "He's building a narrative," she said slowly. "He's building leverage. There's a difference. The narrative is what he sells once the leverage is in place. Right now he's still constructing the leverage." The cold March air moved through the garden. Rosalind's dress was not warm enough for a stone terrace in March, and she became aware of this fact and didn't move. "Why do you know any of this?" Something shifted in his expression, a slight tightening around the eyes, visible only because she'd been watching him carefully enough to notice it. "Because Sebastian Crane did the same thing to someone I know, 4 years ago, in Seoul, and that person no longer has the work they spent a decade building." She waited. He didn't elaborate. She understood that she was being given the edge of something, the outline of a shape, not its full dimensions. "What do you want from tonight?" she asked. Evidence of his methods. Crane tends to move quickly when he senses opportunity. If he believes you're not alone, if he believes you have someone beside you who understands the landscape he operates in, he's likely to make a move that's harder for him to conceal than his usual approach. "You want to use me as bait. I want to offer you protection that happens to benefit us both. There's a difference." She looked at him for a long time. She was a scientist. She gathered data and assessed probability and evaluated risk. She did not make decisions based on the way a man's hands had felt. Careful, asking, at her face and waist 45 minutes ago. "One condition," she said. "Everything you have on him, every piece of documentation, every timeline, every contact, I get access to it. For my legal case, non-negotiable." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something that was considering whether to become one. He agreed. They moved through the room like people who knew each other. It wasn't difficult. He was attentive in the particular way that other people notice without quite being able to articulate. The slight lean when she spoke, the way his attention tracked her in a room even when he was looking elsewhere, the ease with which his hand came to the small of her back when the crowd pressed close. None of it was theatrical. That was what made it convincing. That was also what made it difficult to keep her thoughts in the category where they belonged. She was a precise person. She believed in the value of clear categories. This was a strategic arrangement between two people with aligned interests. Hyunjun Im was a man she'd met 90 minutes ago. The warmth of his hand through the fabric of her dress was sensory data, with no bearing on any decision she needed to make. Her brain was going to disagree with her about this. She could already feel it preparing its argument. Sebastian Crane found them at 10:17. He approached from the left, smooth as water finding a channel, with a smile engineered to the precise width that reads as cordial without communicating warmth. He was a handsome man in the way that certain structures are handsome, all proportion and no life. Rosalind. What a pleasant surprise. She felt Hyunjun's hand shift fractionally at her back. The subtlest possible steadying. Sebastian. Flat. Polite. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I'm on the Foundation's advisory board. I try never to miss the March event." His gaze moved to Hyunjun with the specific attention of someone cataloging a variable they hadn't built into their model. "I don't think we've been introduced." Hyunjun extended his hand with the ease of someone who has shaken 1,000 hands in rooms like this one. Hyunjun Im. Im Capital Partners. The calculation in Crane's eyes sharpened, reorganized, and smoothed over, all in under a second. "Of course. I've come across your firm, Seoul-based, primarily. Primarily. We have significant interest in London at the moment." "And how do you know Rosalind?" She answered before Hyunjun could. "We met through a mutual contact in the research investment space, several months ago." Clean, specific. Difficult to verify quickly. She felt the lie settle between them like something solid. Crane's smile didn't move, but his posture did. A barely perceptible recalibration. The adjustment of someone who has walked into a room expecting one layout and found another. "I've been hoping we might find an opportunity to speak, Rosalind, about the Edinburgh matter. I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding that a direct conversation might. I believe your representatives and her solicitors are in communication," Hyunjun said pleasantly, conversationally. as though the observation were helpful rather than a wall. Isn't that the appropriate channel for a matter of that nature? A beat. Small and very significant. What indeed? Crane's eyes returned to Rosalind, and in them she saw, briefly, the recalculation happening in real time. Another time, perhaps. He moved away. She tracked him with peripheral vision until he disappeared into a cluster near the far end of the room. Then she exhaled. One long, careful breath. He didn't like that. No, which means he'll try a different approach. Hyunjun was watching the room with the same perfectly calibrated neutrality from the bar. Soon, possibly tonight, what do we do? Stay visible, stay close. Make it very clear that you aren't alone. A pause. Then, more quietly, how are you holding up? Such a simple question. Such an ordinary question. She had been asked versions of it for 8 months by her solicitors and her colleagues and Dr. Okonkwo, and somehow none of them had managed to make it sound quite like that. Like the answer actually mattered to the person asking, not as information to be processed and acted upon, but simply as a thing worth knowing. I'm fine, she said. And then, because she valued accuracy, mostly. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, once, and she understood that he was going to let her have that, the mostly, without pressing it. She found that she appreciated it more than she would have liked. She had given him her number before they'd left the gala. Standing in the entrance hall with the sounds of the party still audible through the closed ballroom doors, she'd typed it into his phone and told him she'd be in touch after she'd spoken to her legal team. He'd said, "Be careful getting home," not, "I'll call you," not, "Let me know how it goes." Just that. Simple and direct, and somehow the thing she'd thought about for most of the night, lying awake in Bermondsey listening to the rain. At 7:30 a.m., she made coffee and opened her laptop and went back through every documented interaction with Sebastian Crane since August 2023. She was building a timeline, not just for her lawyers, but for herself. To remind herself that what felt, in her worst moments, like disproportionate fear, was actually pattern recognition. That her responses were calibrated. That she was not someone who asked strangers to kiss her at galas out of nothing. She was someone who had reached a limit, and she had handled it. Her phone rang at 9:14. Her colleague Dr. Felix Hartmann, who handled the administrative infrastructure of their research project. His voice had the quality of someone who has been rehearsing a difficult conversation and has not entirely succeeded in making it sound rehearsed. Rosalind. Have you checked your email this morning? Not yet. What's happened? There's been a formal inquiry from the university's Research Ethics Board. Someone has filed a complaint alleging that a portion of our 2019 dataset was obtained improperly, that there was a data sharing agreement with Crane Whitmore Capital that your team failed to honor. She set down her coffee, set it down with both hands, carefully, the way you put down something fragile. That is categorically false. I know that. The ethics board knows the complaint will require substantial documentation to proceed. But Rosalind, a breath. It's been filed. Formally, there's going to be a review period. The research is on hold. The research, 4 years, 12 team members. The diagnostic model that their preliminary data, peer-reviewed, replicated, corroborated by independent consultants, suggested could identify early markers of neurodegenerative disease up to 8 years before symptom onset. 8 years. For a patient population that currently had, in the best cases, months between diagnosis and the loss of the window for meaningful intervention, on hold. Her hands were very still on the table. Well, when was this filed? Yesterday evening, time-stamped 11:42 p.m. 1 hour and 25 minutes after Sebastian Crane had recalibrated in a Mayfair ballroom and walked away. She had texted Hyunjun at 9:30, 3 sentences, no preamble. He'd suggested the London Bridge Cafe 40 minutes, and she'd arrived first and was on her second coffee when he walked in. He looked like a man who'd also had a short night and had decided, with characteristic precision, that this was not information anyone needed. She told him about the ethics complaint. He listened without interrupting, without the impatient fidgeting that some people can't suppress when they already know what someone is about to say. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Genuinely quiet. The kind that means thinking, rather than the kind that means forming a response. This is his standard approach, he said. Create a procedural obstacle. Something that carries the appearance of legitimacy. Something that puts the burden of proof on you. You've seen him do this before. Yes. To the person in soul. Yes. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and sat with that for a moment. Who was it? And when he paused, you said you'd give me everything you have. That was the agreement. A longer quiet than before. The sounds of the cafe moved around them. The hiss of the espresso machine, a low conversation 2 tables away, the dense rumble of the street. My sister, he said. Kim Ji-yeon. She was a materials scientist, biocompatible polymers. She'd developed a proprietary manufacturing process that had applications in medical device fabrication. 5 years of work from her doctorate through the early company stage. Crane's firm funded part of the prototype phase in 2019 and withdrew when early production costs looked prohibitive at scale. Rosalind was very still. He filed a similar claim, a data sharing allegation, the same shape as yours, the same procedural framing. She was dragged into a 2-year arbitration. Her entire company was built on that polymer process. By the time the arbitration cleared her, completely, without qualification, the window had closed. Her primary investor had moved on. A competitor had entered the space with a similar product, not identical, close enough to make her process redundant. She lost the company. She lost 5 years. He set his cup down with the careful deliberateness of someone who is very angry and has decided that the anger will be more useful kept contained. She is fine. She has rebuilt in Amsterdam, and she is doing well. But I have spent 3 years learning everything about Sebastian Crane's methods and his history and his network, because I decided that what happened to my sister was not going to keep happening to other people while I stood to the side of it. The shape of the previous night rearranged itself in Rosalind's understanding, not the facts of it. She'd already known he had his own reasons. But the weight behind those reasons, the 5 years of his sister's life, the 3 years of his own, the meticulous, patient accumulation of something that could not be accumulated quickly if it was going to hold. You should have told me last night, she said. Yes, he said. I should have. No qualification. No explanation of why he hadn't. Just the acknowledgement, clean as a calculation and twice as honest. She looked at him for a moment. Then she opened the folder she'd brought and slid it across the table. Then let's start from the beginning. Everything I have. Everything you have. We build this together, or not at all. They met 4 more times that week. Once at her office in the King's College London Research Building. Once at his firm's London space in a glass and steel building near Canary Wharf. And twice at the London Bridge Cafe, which had acquired Munn without either of them naming this, the status of their place. They went through documentation with the focused intensity of 2 people who had the same objective and different methodological instincts. She worked in ordered layers, chronological, then thematic, then cross-referenced. He worked in patterns, identifying points of convergence and pressure, and looking for what sat at the intersection. The approaches were compatible in a way that required negotiation, and was therefore occasionally tense and consistently productive. She learned things about him without him telling her. He arrived 8 to 10 minutes early to everything, which she recognized as the habit of someone for whom lateness felt like a failure of preparation. He read documents the way she did, start to end, nothing skimmed, margin notes, and he had a handwriting that was precise and extremely small. He drank coffee only before noon, switching to sparkling water in the afternoon, and he seemed unbothered by long silences in a way that she found, after a lifetime of people who filled silence compulsively, genuinely restful. He was patient. He was precise. And she was becoming increasingly clear on this, very difficult to stop thinking about when he wasn't in the room. On Thursday evening, after a long working session at his office that had run well past 9, he walked her to the lift, and they stood in the hallway waiting, and the building was quiet around them, and she became conscious of how close he was standing, and of the way he was looking at her with the expression she still didn't have a full name for. "You should eat something," he said. "You had half a sandwich at lunch." "You were counting my sandwiches." "I was observing." "It's a habit." "And what else have you observed?" A pause, his particular kind, the one that means considering rather than delaying. "That you're very good at making yourself seem fine when you aren't, and that you've been doing it for long enough that you sometimes forget there's a difference." The lift doors opened. She stepped in and turned around. He was still standing in the hallway, his hands in his pockets, with the expression that she'd finally identified as the thing his face did when he wasn't performing composure, when he was simply being it. "Good night, Hyunjun." "Good night, Rosalind." The doors closed. She stood against the back wall of the lift and looked at the ceiling and made a clear, deliberate decision to be very careful. She was not very careful. The ethics board review had been underway for 2 weeks. The research was paused. Rosalind's team, 12 people, 8 of whom had structured their careers specifically to work on this model, 4 of whom had turned down other positions to stay, were doing what they could, writing supplementary documentation, preparing for the review panel, maintaining the kind of focused calm that requires an enormous internal expenditure when the ground has shifted beneath everything you've built. She had told them as little as she could while remaining honest. The complaint was baseless. The documentation was strong. The process would take time. She had said these things with conviction because they were true, and she had not said the rest. About Sebastian Crane, about Hyunjun Im, about the 3 years of accumulated pattern that they were building into something that could finally be taken somewhere, because she did not want them to carry more of this than was necessary. She was learning that this instinct, while kind, was also isolating, that there was a cost to carrying things by yourself that didn't show up until you'd been doing it for 8 months, and someone asked how you were holding up, and you felt something in your chest that was either gratitude or grief, and you couldn't immediately tell which. The envelope arrived by courier at 3:40 p.m. It was from Crane's personal solicitors, a firm in the city, with a name that had 3 surnames in it, and offices in 6 countries. Inside was a formal letter, measured, lawyerly, every word carrying the particular weight of language that has been carefully selected to be difficult to challenge without appearing unreasonable. The offer was simple. If Dr. Thorne was willing to enter into a mediated data sharing agreement, voluntarily, before the ethics review concluded, the formal complaint would be withdrawn. The research could resume immediately. A specified percentage of future licensing revenue would be directed to Crane Whitmore Capital in recognition of what the letter described as their foundational investment contribution. She read it twice. Then she sat back and looked at the ceiling of her office. She recognized it immediately for what it was, a way out that was also a door in. Sign the agreement, and she confirmed that there was something to share, that his claim had enough validity that she'd been willing to negotiate rather than fight. She legitimized the method. She handed him a precedent, and she made it possible, when the next person tried to resist, for him to point to her and say, "This is what resolution looks like. This is what reasonable people do." She photographed the letter, sent it to her solicitors, and then texted Hyunjun 2 sentences. He made his move. Formal letter. Data sharing agreement or the ethics complaint stays open indefinitely. The reply came in less than a minute. Don't sign anything. I'm coming to you. He was there in 40 minutes. He came in, sat down across from her desk, and she handed him the letter without preamble. He read it the way he read everything, start to finish, nothing skimmed. When he finished, he set it down on the desk and looked at her. He escalated faster than I expected, he said, because the gala disrupted his timeline. He thought I was alone and manageable, and we showed him I wasn't. Yes. Which means he's under more pressure than he's used to operating under. Pressure makes people move less carefully. Which means if we can get him to make one more move. Rosalind, the way he said her name, quiet, direct, with the particular gravity of someone who is about to say something they have been building toward, made her stop. I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you before now. She waited. Outside, the rain had started again, the consistent, patient London rain that seems less like weather than like a condition of existence. The mutual contact who included me in the Harwick Gala invitation, it wasn't incidental. I asked to be included. Specifically, because I had learned that Crane would be there, and I had also learned, through someone at the Harwick Foundation who knew your department head, that you would be there. I knew about your situation before that night. The rain, the muted sound of the corridor outside, the particular quality of a silence that has something living in it, pressing against the walls. You knew about me. I knew you were a target. I wanted to observe what he would do in a room where you were present, whether he would approach you directly, whether he'd use an intermediary, what his timing would be. I did not know you would approach me. I did not know. He stopped. Then, without the hedge, I didn't anticipate any of what actually happened. The kiss, any of it, the week, this. She stood up, walked to the window. The rain was steady against the glass. She looked at it for a moment. 8 months of being watched without her consent. 8 months of being assessed as a target, a resource, something with value that someone else wanted to extract. And now this. The man she'd spent a week building something with. Something that had begun to feel like genuine trust, and underneath it a layer she hadn't seen. She was not angry in the way that roars. She was angry in the way that goes very, very quiet. I need you to leave, she said. Please. Rosalind, I'm not asking twice. He left. She heard the door close with the careful softness of someone who understood that this was not the moment for any sound that could be read as force. She stood at the window for a long time. Long enough that the quality of the light changed. Then she sat back down at her desk, opened her laptop, and got back to work. Because she was Rosalind Thorne, and she had not survived 8 months of Sebastian Crane by stopping when things became unbearable. 3 messages over 3 days. She had appreciated the spacing, not silence, which would have felt like abandonment, and not a flood, which would have felt like pressure. Just presence, at a measured distance, which was the kind of thing you learned to do when you were very careful about not taking up more space than you'd been given. The first, I understand. I'm not asking you for anything, but the work we've been doing matters regardless of anything between us, and you should have everything I've compiled. I'll send it through your solicitors if that makes it easier. The second, the following evening. My sister asked about you. I told her more than I meant to. The third, at 11:23 p.m., on the third night, I would do the gala differently. Not the kiss, that I wouldn't change, but everything before it. I should have been honest with you from the moment I knew what I knew. I'm sorry. She read the third message 4 times. Then she put her phone face down on the kitchen counter and went to stand at the window of her flat and look at the lights of Bermondsey at night. And she thought about the difference between someone who calculates you and someone who sees you, and which of those things Hyunjun Im had done, or whether it was possible, in some configurations of honesty and imperfection, for a person to do both at once. She was still standing at the window when her phone rang. Not a text, a call. Dr. Priya Sengel, her most methodical team member, The person who had never in 4 years of working together called her after 10 p.m. "Priya, what's happened?" "Someone accessed the lab." Priya's voice was tight with the specific quality of someone who is managing their own alarm in order to be useful. "About an hour ago, building security called me. I'm listed as emergency contact after you. They don't think anything was taken, but Rosalind..." "They were in the server room. The drives, still there. External backups intact. But they had time. They connected an external device before the alarm triggered." She was already moving toward her coat. "Don't touch anything. Call university security and stay with them until I get there." She was halfway to the door when she stopped, made herself stand still for 10 seconds. Then she picked up her phone and texted Hyunjun. He broke into my lab. Someone tried to copy data from the servers tonight. 43 seconds. On my way. Please don't go alone." He arrived 7 minutes after she did. She was in the server room with the university security officer, Priya, and a police constable who'd responded to the campus alarm, going through the partial access log when she heard the door to the corridor and looked up. He walked in carrying his laptop case, and with the expression of someone who has been waiting a long time for a thing to happen and has discovered that being right about it is not, in fact, a comfort. He looked at the server rack, at the constable, at the partial data log the security officer was showing her. He didn't say anything to her directly. He didn't have to. The moment his eyes met hers across the room, something between them settled. Not warmly, not yet, but solidly. The way a structure settles when a load-bearing piece is put back in place. What did they get? A partial copy of the raw 2019 dataset. The external drive capacity cut off the transfer before it completed. Fragments, not the full dataset. Fragments they'll represent as the complete picture. He nodded. Then he opened his laptop case and took out a hard drive and a folder of printed documents. Then it's time to use what we have. What he had. What 3 years of patient, meticulous, furious work had produced was a pattern. Not one instance of Sebastian Crane's method, but 5. 5 researchers across 3 countries, spanning 12 years. 5 cases of partial funding withdrawal, followed by data access demands, followed by ethics complaints or legal challenges, followed by either forced settlement or destroyed careers. He had their names, their documentation, their timelines. He had corroborating correspondence, in several cases from sources within Crane's own network. He had affidavits from 4 of the 5 Karshka signed, notarized, legally prepared. And now he had something he hadn't had before tonight, a physical break-in, captured on university security cameras, conducted by 2 individuals who appeared, with a specificity that Hyunjun documented on the spot, by pulling comparative records on his laptop in previous instances of interference in 2 of the other cases. A digital fingerprint, a connection that linked this event, tangible, criminal, indisputable, to a pattern that had previously been provable only through circumstance. This goes to the Metropolitan Police tonight, directly, not through a liaison. The footage, the access logs, the comparative records, and to the Financial Conduct Authority tomorrow morning, because 3 of the 5 cases involved research with commercial applications and the data extraction constitutes conduct that meets the threshold for market manipulation, and simultaneously to the legal team at King's College, because institutional momentum matters in these processes. The constable was taking notes with the attentiveness of someone encountering a situation considerably more complex than the typical campus incident. Priya was reading one of the printed timelines with the expression of someone who has just understood something large and is deciding how to sit with it. The security officer had quietly called in 2 additional colleagues. Rosalind was watching Hyunjun. "You built this for 3 years," she said. "My sister lost 5. 3 seemed proportionate. Nothing sardonic in it, just mathematics, and behind the mathematics. Something that had learned to express itself in precision because precision was what it had." The police had taken their statements. The university security team had everything they needed. Priya had gone home with a reassurance that was also a promise. The constable had the hard drive and 3 folders of supporting documentation and the look of someone who had come out at midnight expecting a routine false alarm and was leaving with the most interesting case file of the month. Rosalind and Hyunjun stood outside in the London night, which was cold and very still. The rain had stopped while they'd been inside and left everything washed clean, the pavements wet and reflective, the lamplight splintered across every surface, the air smelling of wet stone and the particular freshness that comes after a long rain. "What happens now?" she asked. "The FCA will move within 2 to 3 weeks if they treat it as pattern conduct rather than isolated incident. My solicitors are filing the multi-jurisdictional complaint first thing this morning, UK, South Korea, Germany, simultaneously. Your legal team will need to formally join. The ethics complaint at the university becomes moot once the criminal investigation opens." "That's not what I meant," she said. A pause. He knew that. She could see that he knew that. "I know." She turned to face him. The lamplight was the particular amber of late-night London, warm on surfaces, leaving everything a little more visible than you expected. "You should have told me from the beginning. That stays true." "Yes. And I'm going to be angry about it for a while. I want you to know that." "That's fair. But..." She found the precise language because she was always more comfortable with precision. "You came tonight. You didn't have to. You had everything in place to file without me. You came because you thought I might be in danger, and you came anyway. And I want you to know that matters to me." He was very still, the kind of still that was not absence but presence. Everything attending. "At the Gala," she said, when he moved toward the far corridor. "You were watching him the whole time, weren't you?" "Even while we were talking?" "Yes. And the night in my office, when I asked you to leave, I waited outside the building for 40 minutes, he said, until I saw your light go out." She absorbed this. "What would you have done," she asked, "if I hadn't asked you? At the Gala? If I'd just stood there and handled it on my own?" The corner of his mouth moved. The expression she'd been trying to name for 3 weeks, the something that might become a smile, which appeared, she had come to understand, specifically in the moments when he was deciding how honest to be. "I would have found a reason to introduce myself anyway. I just hadn't figured out how to do it without starting with the part I hadn't told you yet. So I made it easier. You made it considerably more complicated." A breath. "And better." "Much better." She looked at him for a long moment. She was a scientist. She had built her entire professional life on the principle that you trust what can be demonstrated, and you hold everything else at a distance until you have enough evidence to decide. She was 31 years old, and she had spent 8 months holding things at a distance, and she was very, very tired of it. "When this is resolved," she said, "when the case is filed and the ethics complaint is dismissed and my research is running again, I want to have dinner with you, not as strategy, not because anyone is watching, just dinner." He didn't answer immediately. Long enough that she wondered if she'd miscalculated something fundamental. And then she looked at his face, really looked, and she saw the expression she hadn't had a name for. The one she'd been watching for 3 weeks, trying to categorize. It was relief, not the surface kind, the deep kind, the kind that moves through a person when something they didn't know they were afraid of turns out not to be true. "Yes," he said. "I would like that very much." The Financial Conduct Authority opened a formal investigation into Sebastian Crane and Crane Whitmore Capital on April 19, 2024, 18 days after the King's College break-in, which was a speed that Rosalind's solicitors described as unusually rapid for a regulatory body and which Hyunjun's solicitors described, without elaboration, as appropriate given the evidence. The multi-jurisdictional complaint had been filed as planned, UK, South Korea, and Germany, simultaneously, on the morning of April 2nd. Crane's legal team had moved to contain it. They were not fast enough. and the containment failed in 3 directions at once, which was the point. The ethics complaint against Rosalind's team was formally withdrawn on April 23rd. The research resumed on May 2nd. By the 2nd week of June, the diagnostic model had passed its first independent external validation review, conducted by a panel that included 2 researchers who had specifically requested to be involved after reading the preliminary data, which was, as Dr. Okonkwo observed with the expression she reserved for outcomes she'd expected all along, a very good sign. Sebastian Crane had not been charged yet. The process moved at institutional pace, steady, grinding, built for permanence rather than speed. He would be charged. The pattern was too well documented, the coordination between all 5 cases too solid, the security footage from King's College too clear and too damning for any competent legal defense to fully neutralize. Her solicitors said this. Hyunjun's solicitors confirmed it. She believed them. She was cautiously and deliberately allowing herself to believe a number of things. On a Thursday evening in the 2nd week of June, she and Hyunjun had dinner at a small Italian restaurant near Borough Market that he'd found through a colleague, and she'd approved based on the menu, which she had researched thoroughly, because she was who she was. It was not, technically, their first dinner. They had eaten together many times over the previous weeks. Sandwiches at her desk, coffee at the London Bridge Cafe that was still, quietly, their cafe, takeaway containers spread across the conference table in his office at 11 p.m. while they went through documents. But this was the first that was only dinner. No folders, no laptops, no strategy. She wore the navy dress, the one from Edinburgh, the one she'd bought for a conference she'd left early and had been unable to throw away for 2 years, and which she had worn exactly twice since. Once to a gala in Mayfair in March, where she'd asked a stranger to kiss her. And now here. He noticed. She saw him notice, the slight pause of recognition when she walked in, and he said nothing about it, which was exactly right. They talked for 3 hours, about his sister Ji-yeon, who was based now in Amsterdam, who had started a new company with polymer applications in sustainable architecture, and was, Hyunjun reported with the particular warmth he reserved for her, already in conversations with 2 major European construction firms, about Dr. Priya Sengal, who had turned out to have been right from the very beginning, about a validation methodology that Rosalind had initially resisted and was now the methodological backbone of the external review, about Seoul, which Rosalind had never visited, about London, which Hyunjun had been navigating for 3 years and still found. He offered this with the dry precision that she'd learned was how he expressed things that genuinely surprised him. Considerably more interesting than anticipated. She asked him what had surprised him. He looked at her across the table with the full, unhurried attention that she'd understood, over the past weeks, was simply how he looked at things he considered worth understanding. You, he said, among other things. Walking back from the restaurant, in the warm June dark, their hands found each other the way water finds a channel, without announcement, without decision, simply because that was the direction gravity was running. She didn't let go. On the bridge, with the Thames moving below them and the lights of the city doing their nightly argument with the dark, he stopped walking and turned to look at her. Last March, he said, if you had asked me to calculate the probability that I'd be standing on a bridge in London in June holding hands with the person who had entirely disrupted 3 years of very careful planning, I disrupted your planning? Entirely, comprehensively, you asked me to kiss you, and nothing I had prepared for that evening accounted for what came after. Good, she said. He kissed her. No emergency this time. No audience, no strategy, nothing to perform, no one watching, and no reason to make it look like anything other than what it was, which was real, which was the thing it had been, she thought, from the very beginning, underneath the emergency and the arrangement and the documents and the 3 weeks of carefully maintained professional distance. Real. Already. The Thames went on doing what the Thames does, patient and dark and entirely indifferent to the lives proceeding on its bridges. The city went on being London, And Rosalind Thorne, who was a scientist and believed in evidence, found that the most persuasive data point she had encountered in a very long time was this: the feeling, bone deep and undeniable, of having found something you didn't know you were looking for and choosing, with full information and clear eyes, to hold on to it. She held on. If this story made you feel something real, leave it in the comments. I read every single one, and yours matters. And if you're new here and this is the first story you found, welcome, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'll see you there.